All right. So everybody, I apologize for the technical difficulties. So sorry about that. So my name is Katie Totman, and I am a historic preservation specialist with the Office of Historic Preservation. And thank you for joining us for this month's Rehabber Club virtual series. We've got Izabella Nuckels with us. She works for Post Oak Preservation Solutions, and she's going to talk to us today about historic paint analysis and colorways. Just some quick housekeeping. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat, and myself and Stephanie will monitor that, and we'll actually take questions at the end of the presentation. And then Izabella will actually have her contact information at the end. So if you have like specific questions related to anything on your house or whatever the case may be, you can also reach out to her directly if we don't have enough time to cover everybody's questions. And with that, I will let Izabella take it away.
All right. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Katie, and thanks, Stephanie, for inviting me to do this. They both know me pretty well, so they know that historic paint is one of my favorite things to talk about. So I was really excited to put together this presentation. As Katie mentioned, I work for Post Oak Preservation Solutions. We are a full-service historic preservation consulting firm out of Texas. We have offices in Austin and San Antonio. I'm an architectural conservator. I also teach materials conservation in the UT Austin Historic Preservation program. So you'll see some photos from some Post Oak projects that we're doing, some design guideline projects that we're doing, as well as some UT projects I've worked on. And I come to historic paint from the standpoint of preserving the historic integrity of a building. So I'm not an interior designer, I'm not an architect. I'm really here to kind of act as a steward in the maintenance and the preservation of existing colors and finishes. The kind of recommendations in this talk and the information are based on guidance set by the National Park Service, which provides guidelines to preservationists for preserving historic properties within the United States. I'm mostly going to be talking about exterior paint on historic properties. Interiors tend to change more frequently. They also have less visibility to the public realm, and they aren't exposed to the same level of deterioration from the environment as exterior finishes, and may not need as frequent updating and repainting. So today we're going to talk about what is paint. What is it? What are we talking about when we say paint? I'll do a very, very brief history of paint and the types of paints and finishes you may come across. We'll talk about elements on your building that you may want to paint and others that you should not paint. We'll talk about selecting a color for your historic building, your historic property. I'll go over a couple of different styles and some typical color schemes. I'll talk about what historic paint analysis is. It's something that I do in my professional practice. It's something that many architectural conservators across the country do to help you identify your original paint color. We'll talk about working with a painter. What kind of questions do you need to ask? What are some best practices when you're repainting a historic building? And then I'm also going to give some references at the end if you're looking for some more in-depth material or additional information. So we're going to dive right in with what is paint. And I just wanted to give us, as the first thing, get everyone on the same page with terminology. You'll also hear when you hear people talking about paint, especially in historic preservation, they'll also be mentioning finishes and coatings. And the reason we do that is these are more general terms when we're talking about coatings on a building or finishes. So finishes would be your most general term. It's really any material that is the final layer on the surface of any building. And then a coating is also material. It's spread over a surface, but it usually has a decorative or a protective purpose. So when we talk about paint. Paint has two main components. Essentially, it is a colorant or a pigment, so something that imparts color that is suspended within a medium or a vehicle. So this paint, which has essentially two parts, but also will have some different additives depending on the type of paint, is applied to then the substrate or the building material, which we call the substrate, in a thin layer, and it dries to create an opaque or a solid film. And so on historic building exteriors, paint is actually a really important component because it serves as a protection for different substrates, different building elements. In particular, it is extremely important for historic wood elements. Moisture or water is one of the main sources of deterioration for wood, as anyone in a historic house has probably seen. So having your protective paint layer is really important in keeping your historic elements that are made out of wood intact. And this is especially important with elements like wood windows, which may have a lot of kind of use and abrasion and wear over time. So maintaining that paint coating is very important to maintaining your historic building. And then, in addition to being a protective coating, paint is also just a really wonderful way to express architectural style. It's a way to understand local and cultural trends, and it's also a way to get a sense of the personality of the owner who, occupied the space at specific periods of time. Paint is not only applied to wood, it may also be on stucco, it may be on metal. We in preservation do not like to put paint on masonry, so that would include brick or stone. If it's already painted, we'll talk about that a little bit later. You may want to reapply it, but in general, we like to keep paint away from those surfaces. Depending on the kind of exposure and the elements, exterior paint usually needs to be reapplied every 5 to 10 years. So anyone who lives in a historic house probably knows that maintenance is just part of kind of living in a historic building. So paint is one of those things that as it wears and deteriorates, you really want to make sure you're actively maintaining it. So just going in a little bit more in depth with the two main components of paint. So you have your colorant. It's usually a pigment. Colorant imparts the color, of course, the opacity, so how solid or transparent it is. Colorants can be inorganic or organic. They can be natural, like stones or plants, or they can be artificial, so synthetically, artificially made. The vehicle, which can be made out of a number of things, including oils, helps to form the coating. The pigment is dispersed throughout, so usually the pigment is ground and dispersed throughout a vehicle or medium. It holds the pigments together, so it's kind of the glue that allows our pigments to stay on our historic buildings. It also provides properties like adhesion and durability. So it's these two main components that really impart the properties of the paint that you're using. So, as I mentioned, the purpose of paint is really to not only protect the substrate and the historic building materials, but to define architectural elements. So it's used in certain ways, especially on 19th and early 20th century building materials. It also helps to just improve the general appearance. We all like our home looking nice, so paint helps us to do that. Exterior paint, unfortunately, is continuously deteriorating. It's not something that you can paint once and leave it alone. You really need to actively and consistently maintain it. So I'm going to give sort of a very brief overview of how we got to this place in paint history and the different types of contemporary paints that you will find, and also the National Park Service recommendations for repainting historic buildings. So paints have been around for tens of thousands of years. We have known cave paintings from over 30,000 years ago. These are some cave paintings from a cave in Big Bend in West Texas. Early cave paintings were made of minerals. Many are still visible. During the 15th century, a Flemish painter named Jan van Eyck created or developed using oils as a binder for paint. Previously, people were using eggs as a binder. He also developed this way of building up oil paint layers and combining them with different pigments. And really, for the first time, this allowed artists and artisans to create detailed work, more realistic work, especially in painting. Around this time, Europeans began expeditions and explorations around the world. New trade routes opened up, new pigments became available, and newer colors came into kind of the repertoire of the Western world, if you will. A couple of examples of these are red dyes that were extracted from the cochineal insect from Oaxaca, Mexico. So these were brought over to Europe. There's a blue mineral called lapis lazuli that originated in Afghanistan. It made its way to Europe, became very popular. The color was known as ultramarine, which means from beyond the seas. This color was very highly prized by many artists. Vermeer used it extensively. You might be familiar with some of his, blue outfits in his paintings. And at the time, this pigment was so highly prized that it was the same cost or sometimes more expensive than the price of gold. So, Vermeer and many other artists left his family in quite a bit of debt when he died due to his sort of fascination with these different pigments and colors. Once we hit the 1700s, Prussian blue was created. It was our first synthetic pigment in kind of the history of paints and colors. It was accidentally created by a chemist who was trying to make the color red. But this sort of started kind of this revolution of different synthetic dyes and pigments that were made. It was also around this time that the first paint mill opened in the United States in Boston. People started manufacturing pigments and different parts of paint. And this sort of led into the Industrial Revolution, which really, between the Industrial Revolution and the textile industry as part of that, there was huge development in artificial dyes and pigments and a wider range of colors that there had ever been before. So at this time, we're in kind of the late 18th century, early 19th century. Painters who are painting houses, buildings, architectural elements are grinding their own pigments. They're mixing them with oils, turpentine, other additives. They're using these very complex, toxic recipes, and they're doing it on site. They're using oil-based paints that are messy. They're hard to get off your hands. They're hard to get off your brushes. They take a long time to dry. They have an extremely noxious odor. So this is kind of where we are in the kind of realm of architectural painting. By the mid-19th century, the first ready mixed paints became available. So these were paints that were pre-mixed. You purchased them and you could just paint kind of after mixing them up your building right then and there. And this was a really big kind of breakthrough in architectural painting. It made it less expensive, it made it more accessible, and it made kind of a greater consistency in the color of paints. In 1877, Henry Sherwin of Sherwin-Williams, or later of Sherwin-Williams, invented a reusable paint can, which seems like a small invention, but it actually really changed the way that paint was able to be used and distributed in the United States. It allowed kind of pre-mixed paint to be packaged and used and then reused after you could reseal the can. Previously, you had to really use all of your paint at once. During the early 1900s, there was this vast market of paints and coatings that developed. White lead had previously been used as a hiding pigment. So it's a pigment that imparts opacity to a paint, and it helps to literally hide the building material from the sun, so it keeps it from deterioration. So white lead was used extensively in all of these paints in the 19th, 18th century until titanium oxide replaced it in the early 1900s. And this is when we started our slow move away from lead paints. During World War II, there was a shortage of linseed oil, which was one of the main components of oil-based paints. There was also an increased need for paint just in the war effort, coupled with the advances from the war effort, the research that was going on. A new material known as an artificial resin or an alkyd was developed, and this was able to replace oils in oil-based paints. These were inexpensive, they were easy to manufacture, and they became sort of a good alternative for oil in those types of paints. After World War, or around World War II in the 1940s, Sherwin-Williams developed the first waterborne acrylic paint. This is also known as a latex paint. This was a time in sort of the post-war era when people were doing a lot of home improvements. They were repainting their interiors, redoing their exteriors, owning homes maybe for the first time. There was a big push towards this DIY effort. And latex paint, the first paint was called Chemtone, was the first paint that you could really wash off of your hands with water. Oil paints are very difficult to remove. They're not very user-friendly. So you'll see a lot of advertisements. This is a Chemtone ad where, it says a different kind of washable wall finish. No muss, no fuss, no bother. So really emphasizing the ease of use. And this is kind of a turning point when the homeowner really was able to start taking on painting and home projects themselves. Around this time, the paint roller was also invented, which helped, once again, the homeowner to paint their homes a little bit more efficiently. And paint manufacturers started taking it upon themselves to phase out lead. So phase out that white lead, the hiding pigment, and also phase out lead-based pigments or pigments that included lead. So this had started before World War II, and lead was officially banned in 1978. So as you know, if you live in a house from pre-1978, you may or may not have lead paint in your home. So this brings us to today. We're still using many of the paints that were developed around World War II and before. Today, the main types of paints that you'll find are waterborne acrylic or latex paint. You'll see different ways that this is kind of marketed and named, but a waterborne acrylic paint is typically a latex paint. And there are also oil-based or alkyd paints as well that you may find. So the National Park Service has a number of preservation briefs. So these are guidelines for different building elements and preservation kind of approaches. And they have one on exterior paint and exterior paint problems. That's National Park Service Preservation Brief number 10. And so in that brief, they recommend that if you are painting a historic building, if your building is from kind of pre-mid-century, it is likely that your original paint layers and some of your subsequent paint layers may be an oil-based paint. One thing that we know about oil and water is they don't mix well. So usually putting a water-based acrylic or latex paint right on oil-based paint is going to result in issues of adhesion. So your new paint may start coming off soon after you apply it. So the National Park Service recommends one of two things. You can use a high quality oil paint over existing coats of historic oil paint, or you can use an oil-based primer with latex as a top coat. Generally, when you're using paint systems, it's helpful to use paint from the same manufacturer. Always follow the manufacturer's instructions, and use paint that's appropriate and compatible with existing layers. So as I mentioned, historic paint coatings are intended to be reapplied and maintained over time. Kind of general paint maintenance involves general maintenance of your building and your site. So making sure water is not in direct contact or in sustained contact with your building envelope. Making sure you're repainting regularly, especially those building elements like windows that get a lot of kind of contact and movement. And also making sure you're prepping your surface for repainting appropriately. So when you're working with a historic building, it's not necessary to remove all of the paint every time you repaint. In fact, it's not recommended to do that. A couple of reasons why you don't want to remove all of the paint are that you can damage the historic material, the substrate, with methods needed to remove, whether those be chemical or mechanical, so by hand. So that is a big one. Another kind of factor is you're really erasing the architectural records, the layers of paint that have been there by removing that paint. And then thirdly, it's really unnecessary. So, one of the tenets of preservation when we're doing building restorations and rehabilitation is repair rather than replace. So really, we're not trying to replace this paint layer, we're trying to repair and maintain it. And so any good paint job starts with good preparation. You need to clean your surface. You may be able to do that just with water. You may need a mild, appropriate detergent, but new paints will not stick to dirt or grease or grime. So you do need a clean surface. In general, you want to scrape loose paint off by hand. You don't want to use any kind of mechanical or power tool that could accidentally harm the substrate. If you are concerned about the presence of lead paint, you can use a spray bottle or a hose and kind of wet the paint before you remove it. If you're doing scraping, same thing with sanding, which you would do after scraping just to create an even surface for paint adhesion. You always want to consider using a wet sandpaper if you're using or working with rather lead-based paints. So when we're talking about historic buildings, there are some elements that you always want to keep painted, like windows, and then there are some elements that you really don't want to be painting. And really the purpose of repainting is to maintain our existing coating and to protect the substrate. So it's really, while it's a wonderful aesthetic, paint is also really a very functional protective coating. Repainting also can help to restore a building to a specific period of significance, whether that's the year it was built or whether that's a different period of significance where kind of an event associated with an event or a person or a different time period. As I mentioned, exterior paint is continuously deteriorating and it does require active and consistent maintenance. As I said, 5 to 10 years, depending on kind of the exposure over the course of its life. Most buildings from the 19th century through the early 20th century, not so much vernacular buildings, but buildings with kind of American architectural styles, have 3 main paint colors on the building. So the first is the body or the building envelope. This was usually, covered in siding. It was usually painted a solid color. Some of the more complex architectural styles like Queen Anne's that have shingles or other textured elements may have 4 or 5 colors, may have additional colors to accent those textured elements, but generally the body is kind of your first main single color or single coat of paint, color of paint on your historic building. Next, you have the trim. The trim is typically painted more of a transitional color that's going to unite your building. As you can see in this building, most historic buildings had a very consistent color in the trim. So it's rare to see somebody painting columns and porch railings and side trim different colors. Usually it was this sort of unified singular color. It almost creates like a line drawing for your historic building. And then lastly, you have your movable elements. So typically doors, windows, and shutters were painted the same color. They were often painted a darker color or a deeper color, and this has kind of the function of giving the perception or the illusion of depth to the building. So it makes the building seem less like a flat facade and gives some dimension to it. So some elements to paint or not to paint. So the biggest thing to remember when you're painting your historic building is only repaint things that have originally been painted. So you want to maintain your existing paint finishes, especially on your windows, especially on your siding, because if water gets in, you can get other issues and you may have to start replacing elements. You want to use colors that are appropriate to the historic style and the district if it is your intention to maintain your historic home in this way. You also want to use an appropriate paint type that's compatible with existing paint layers, specifically the paint layer right underneath. Otherwise, your paint's just going to start coming off pretty quickly. So some things that you don't want to do. You don't want to paint building elements that were not historically painted. So this changes kind of the effect, the aesthetic of the building. If your intention is really preservation, you should be there just to maintain the building kind of as you are a steward of the property. You don't want to paint masonry. This is an important thing to remember. And when I say masonry, I'm talking about brick, I'm talking about limestone, I'm talking about granite, any kind of stone or manufactured material like brick. Part of the reason is these materials are very porous. They need to breathe. Water needs to be able to move in and out of them. This is one of the reasons why having compatible mortars in historic buildings is important, just allowing water to move in and out. If you paint the surface, you can end up with a lot of different issues, deterioration, destabilization of the masonry. So unless the masonry has been historically painted, you really don't want to paint masonry. Also, don't paint unpainted metals. So copper doesn't need to be painted. If you have bronze elements, those can be treated in different ways, but they do not need paints. Don't paint roofing elements such as tile that were not painted. Sometimes you'll see metal roofing, like the building in this image at the top has red painted metal standing seam roof. It was historically like that. That can be repainted, but don't start painting roofing elements that were not painted. As I mentioned before, it is not a great idea to remove paint unless absolutely necessary. So you really want to just be repainting over that surface. And then don't paint hardware. Doorknobs and locks and hardware on windows do not need to be painted. They really actually need to be, removed if possible and stored while the painting is going on and then replaced or very carefully taped off. So it's better to remove and protect them, especially if they're historic hardware, rather than have to use different chemicals to remove the paint later. So, one of the things to think about, how do you know if it's time to repaint? So, do a visual inspection. Is paint coming off? Are you missing paint? Has the color started fading? Certain colors will fade under exposure to UV, which of course, or ultraviolet light, or sunlight, which we have a lot of in Texas. Are you seeing conditions other than a nice flat paint layer? If you are, it might be time to repaint. So there's no, fancy way to assess that other than giving it a look and seeing if the paint, coat is intact. Again, things like doors and windows will need repainting more frequently, more often than kind of bigger expanses like siding. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about selecting a color for your historic property. So the paint color for your historic property, your historic building, should be, if you're kind of moving towards preservation, should be appropriate for the architectural style. So different styles have different appropriate colors, and to your historic district if you are in a historic district. And if you are in a historic district, your district may have certain guidelines or recommendations for paint colors and paint schemes. As I mentioned before, these are kind of the three main colors that you'll see on those 19th century, early 20th century building: the body, so the main envelope of the building, the trim, and then your movable elements, so your windows and doors and shutters. So, up until really World War II, there was a pretty limited palette of colors that people used to paint their homes. They tended to be more muted, deep colors. Many of them were sort of inspired or derived by natural pigments. And while we have these immense fan decks of colors available today, you can really pick any color that you could dream of. They might not all be appropriate for the style of your historic property. Just like architectural elements like roof form and ornamentation, porches, window style, paint color is also an element of the style of your historic building. So, part of preserving that building is also preserving the color and the aesthetic. So there are a couple of ways to start researching and determining an appropriate color scheme. Research the history of your building. Do you have any access to historic photographs? Are there any narratives about what it looked like when it came out? Newspaper articles, oral history, reference books on the property's style. There are a number of books out about, architectural styles in Texas, history in Texas. Look at color palettes and paint catalogs available during the period of significance when, the house was painted to look like you would like it to look now. And then another way to determine an appropriate color scheme is to undertake historic paint analysis, which I will talk about next. And that's a way of using microscopic analysis to determine what the original or earlier colors were. So I'm going to share just a couple of styles and their typical color schemes. This is not all of them. I know that there are many styles of architecture in San Antonio, so this is just a few. But starting with Greek Revival, the Revival styles. So for this, again, you have your body, your trim, and then your sort of movable elements. The body of these was usually white, pale blue, gray, tan, ochre, yellow, something a lighter color. The trim was often white or an off-white, a lighter color. And then the doors and shutters were often green. Windows often had black window trim. So this building has, white trim, it has a light blue body, and it has black trim around the windows. For revival styles, which have a lot of elements like columns, different kind of trim elements, you want to avoid adding too many colors. So there may be temptation to, paint the columns one color and paint the trim a different color, but really these buildings have very simple, limited color schemes. We also have our folk Victorian houses, which date to the late 19th century through the turn of the century. These had a greater use of natural earth tones. The windows and shutters were often darker colors than you saw in kind of previous styles. Again, the bodies of these were often white or off-white. They also may be earth tones, ochres, wheats, sometimes greens. The trim was typically a transitional color between the body and those movable elements. As you see in this folk Victorian house, the trim kind of acts as this unifying element. It really sort of outlines the architectural design of the building. Shutters were typically a dark color. Shutters, doors, and window sashes were typically a dark color, maybe a green, olive, black, maroon, something of that nature. And, it's important to remember that the three kind of color schemes are usually very complementary to one another. Queen Anne style homes date from the turn of the century. These are more complex buildings, so they could have up to 5 different colors with some differentiation in the ornamentation, especially if they have textured surfaces like shingles. These are some images from an 1890s paint catalog from Heath and Milligan, and so they have a bunch of pages of, this is a pretty simplified sort of Queen Anne folk Victorian home, but they have a bunch of different color schemes that you can use for your house. And these color schemes actually have different colors for the roof, but they have kind of different ways that you can apply color on these sort of Queen Anne styled homes. Usually the body was similar to the folk Victorian, white, off-white cream, kind of earth tones with transitional colors, and then darker doors and shutters. Queen Anne's tended to be a little bit, had deeper colors than folk Victorians, but sort of similar palettes. With these houses, there's sometimes a temptation to use very bright colors, pastels, but they actually tended to be more somber in their color schemes, thinking of the Victorian era. One thing to remember with these is to, avoid painting stained shingles. You only want to paint surfaces that have historically been painted. Also avoid the temptation to add too many colors, especially if you have a lot of decorative elements on windows, porches, different wood ornamentation. So, we have our craftsman houses, which were very popular at the beginning of the 20th century. These tended to have more natural colors that were warm and subdued. Craftsman houses prior to World War I tended to be darker colors, and then after the war, they tended to be lighter colors. So the bodies, when they were lighter, may have been light green, brown, yellow, sometimes red. The darker colors were similar colors, just in darker tones, so greens, browns, yellows. The trim was typically a transitional color, sometimes a darker transitional color if the body was light, and then doors and shutters. And windows, if you were looking at kind of a light colored body, may have been dark colors like dark green, brown, reds, black, and if it was a darker body, light green, brown, yellow, and so on. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in kind of understanding more about what some of the historic paint schemes may have been for your historic home, to peruse some of the historic paint catalogs that are available. There are a lot available online. you know, in addition to doing your historic research. Not only do, you know, the paint catalogs have great information about what types of paints were available and what color schemes may have been applied to homes, but they also have, you know, information about what paints were made of, how they were applied, you know, some trends and marketing kind of avenues of the time. This is a page from a 1935 Lowe Brother catalog on how to style the paint in your home to match your outfit, and I guess what styled outfits are not so appropriate. And one thing I would add to architectural styles and paint colors is similar to how styles take on somewhat of kind of a local kind of essence, you know, paint colors may also be informed by, you know, local people, local trends, local preferences. You know, if somebody painted their house one color in a neighborhood, there may be other houses in that neighborhood at the same period of time painted that color. So, you know, understanding the context of your kind of local environment is important as well. So I'm going to give a little overview of what historic paint analysis is. This is, as I mentioned, something that many architectural conservators are able to do. So if you're interested in identifying the original or the first color of your house, or really kind of the chronology of colors in your house, there's a process called historic paint analysis or historic finish analysis, where conservators use microscopic analysis of cross sections of paint samples to identify the chronology, so the different paint layers and coatings on a building element. So this, you know, can help to understand the first paint color or some of the later paint colors in a building. You know, it can help to understand different trends over time. And then it can also help with understanding sort of the history of the building. Maybe you're not sure if elements have been replaced, which element in the or section of the building might be an addition. So, you know, matching up paint colors is a way to do that. So I'm going to talk about, you know, how you go about historic paint analysis. I'm going to do that by following a project that I did at UT. This is a house called E1027 in the south of France. It was designed by an Irish artist and architect named Eileen Gray, completed in the late 1920s. So we did a complete historic finish analysis of the interior of the building. And so, you know, when you're starting historic paint analysis or finish analysis, really your methodology is you start by doing research and understanding the context of the building. So, you know, understanding those potential local trends, what paints are available, you know, what paints are associated with the styles of the time. So we did a lot of research on Eileen Gray's work and different documentation of the building. At the time, there were references to a paint system called REPAINTING, which is a French paint company that was around at that time. And we were able to access catalogs of the paint swatches that may have been used on the building. We then went to the building site. Typically, when you do paint analysis, you take quite a few samples. So we took hundreds of paint samples from all over the building. We took the samples back to the lab at UT. We processed them by casting them in resin cubes in order to see the cross section. So these are very small samples. They are, you know, maybe a 1/4 inch in diameter, and they're the thickness of a layer of paint. When you're doing paint analysis, you always need to take a sample that includes the substrate. So it's the building material onto which the paint is applied or the finish is applied. And then we used microscopic analysis and visual inspection to match them to a standardized color system. So in this case, we used the Munsell color system, which is a standard color system that uses hue, value, and chroma to to describe colors. It's more in terms of doing documentation and working with historic buildings. Standard colored systems are better than using commercial paint systems, since those colors tend to change over time. The way that you interpret these paint samples, so these are photomicrographs, which are photographs taken through a microscope, is that the substrate and the earliest paint layers are at the bottom, and then moving up you can see subsequent paint layers and campaigns. You can see in both of these samples they had a number of different colors and paint layers over time. And this is kind of what the whole analysis and a recommendation would look like. That's a site where a tiny paint sample was taken. That's a photomicrograph. You can see that this entryway was originally painted. This is actually it looks black, but it's actually a very deep dark blue color. It was repainted many times. Somebody decided at some point in time it was a good idea to paint it bright orange, which they did. We have photographic documentation of that. And then they decided to go back to the original color. So we went in and matched the kind of first color just as a record, and it's been restored to that color since. This is another example of, a pretty nice photomicrograph. This is actually inside of a closet where somebody was testing different paint colors. So you can see a bunch of different colors that were found in other parts of the building, but in this we found that they tested this kind of very pale yellow color as well as a light blue. And ultimately, after taking many hundreds of samples, as I said, we came up with a color scheme that was consistent with the work of Eileen Gray as well as her subsequent buildings. I also just wanted to throw in a little sneak peek of a project that my class at UT is working on. So some UT students, Sarah Patrick, Mitch Ford, Sydney Burt, and Lisa McCora, took samples at the Kelso House, which for those of you who are in San Antonio, you might be familiar. It's a house on West Craig Drive. Most of the samples had a number of layers. They had a kind of neutral sort of off-white layer first, and then they had this really nice sort of light green layer throughout the building subsequently. So we have been working hard on a project to match all of the colors on the Kelso House. So you've identified that your building is in need of repainting. So it's been so many years, your paint coating is failing. Hopefully it doesn't look quite like the Kelso House. Hopefully it's a little bit more intact. And you're ready to work with a painter. Maybe you don't want to do the painting yourself. You want to hire a painter to come on and help you out. So here's some sort of tips for successful repainting, and then I'll talk about what to ask your painter and what kind of discussions to have. So you want to do your adequate, appropriate surface preparation. So you can only paint on clean surfaces. Paint will not adhere to soil, dirty, greasy surfaces. You have to clean your surface. Usually you want to scrape off any loose paint. Again, you don't want to remove the paint. You just want to prepare the surface for the new paint layer to protect your historic material. And then lastly, you want to sand any areas that, may be uneven or may not take paint well. This is a good time to go in and do repairs. Do you have any holes in your substrate, whether it's wood or stucco or another material? Do you have any holes from maybe nails that came out, or do you have any cracks? Go ahead and fill those with kind of an appropriate filler material. The National Park Service briefs have a variety of information on kind of different repairs based on your material that you can always reference. It's a good idea to just address those before you paint. So when you're in this maintenance mode, you're preparing your surface, go ahead and take care of any areas where water could penetrate the historic material, and you could have more deterioration. Avoid long periods of exposing the substrate while painting or before painting. So, maybe your building really needs a lot of repairs and preparation before painting. Maybe it hasn't been painted in a very long time. You really don't want to let your substrate be exposed to elements for too long. So try to, have this all happen in a pretty short amount of time. It's always best practice, if possible, to remove hardware before painting rather than paint it or tape it off and then reinstall it after the paint has fully and completely dried. As I mentioned, you want to select a paint that is compatible with the existing paint. The paint layer right underneath. One reason for that is if you have an incompatible paint, it's not going to stay and you're just going to have to repaint pretty soon afterwards. So, making sure you have that compatible paint. One way to try that is you can do some tests, different paints, to see how it works out. Generally, you want to use a primer and 2 finish coats, but it really is very dependent on your building condition, existing paint, what type of paint you're using, etc. When you're working with historic materials, quality is always beneficial. Using high quality materials, whatever is, affordable within your painting budget. This is something that your painter should know, but you have to have appropriate weather for successful painting. So ideally you want to paint between 45 and 90 degrees, ideally a little cooler, 50 to 80. I know it gets hot in Texas, so that can be tricky. You don't want to paint in direct sunlight. So if you've got the sun beating down on your building and you're painting it, it's actually going to cause the paint to dry too quickly and it's not going to adhere properly. And then you're going to have to do your repainting again. And when I say not adhering properly, your paint layer is going to start lifting off pretty soon. Another thing to watch out for that we have a lot of in Texas is moisture from high humidity. So having too much moisture in the air can also prevent proper adhesion of your new paint layer. So, it's always ideal in preservation to work when it's about 75 degrees and partly cloudy, which is a difficult day to get, but, something to keep in mind when you're working on your maintenance project. Fall is usually a nice time to do repainting. It's not usually too rainy and it's usually pretty temperate. And then of course, if you're taping anything off, you want to remove that painter's tape as soon as possible. Leaving it on for even just a week can actually cause damage to the materials that it's over. So trying to remove that as soon as the paint is dry. So a couple of questions you might want to ask your painter who you're working on. Have you ever worked on a historic building? It's a little different than working on new construction, which usually has originally been coated with new paints, oftentimes latex paints. It's a little easier to work with. Ask them how they're prepping the surface. Are they doing that by hand? You don't want anyone using any power tools or mechanical equipment to prepare your surface, because that could damage your substrate. It could damage your building materials, and wood in particular. Once you put a big gouge in your wood siding, starting to fill things like that really is not great for the long-term preservation of your historic materials. Ask your painter, what is their procedure for working with lead-based paint? Have they worked with it before? Do they have certifications to work with it? What is their approach to that? You want to make sure that they're acknowledging when you're working on a historic building that there might be lead-based paint and that their crew or themselves are taking appropriate personal safety precautions. Will the painter address any of those cracks, nail holes, other surface issues after they've prepped the paint? Do you have to do those? Do they know how to do that? Do they know the appropriate materials to do that? How are they planning on protecting building features such as, metal hardware or other elements? Especially if you have historic building features, you don't want to have to get paint on those and then have to use some kind of chemical cleaner to remove it. How long will the project take? This is something, especially when we're talking about building material or historic materials, we don't want to leave that painter's tape up too long. Oftentimes we may have to remove our hardware. We don't want to have doors without doorknobs for too long. So, understanding that it's different than working on a new building, they may have to plan to work a little bit faster. And then lastly, what type of paint system are you using? Are they familiar with painting over existing oil-based paint? Do they have an understanding of what that means? Do they have an understanding of compatible paints? Have they used the paint, the primer and the top coat that you are recommending before? How comfortable are they with it? So those are kind of some of the initial questions you want to ask your painter, and just get a good dialogue and make sure you and the painter are comfortable with the approach that they're taking. Then lastly, I just wanted to leave you all with a couple of resources that you can go to get a little bit more information. Start your research and your different kind of approaches to painting your historic building. As I keep mentioning, the National Park Service has a bunch of preservation briefs pertaining to exterior paint and woodwork. Number 10 is exterior paint problems on historic woodwork. So this is the one that gave some recommendations about paint types. It also has more information about, when you might need to remove more of your historic paint layers, different problems you may see. There's one on painting historic interiors, if that's something you're approaching, if you have some interior plaster work that you need to paint. There's a preservation brief on appropriate methods for reducing lead paint hazards in historic housing. So I would encourage you to look at that if you have questions about lead paint hazards, which many of us do in historic buildings. And then preservation brief number 47, it's about maintaining the exterior of your small and medium-sized historic buildings. So, it gives you a good maintenance guide. When do you need to look at things? How often should you kind of repaint, do visual inspections, things of that nature. Some other good resources to go to are always, the City of San Antonio has great design standards for historic properties. So I'd encourage you to get familiar with those. They have some good guidance on maintenance. If you're in a local historic district, or if you have an adjacent local historic district, those design standards are always helpful to take a peek at. Virginia McAllister's Field Guide to American Houses. If you aren't sure what style your house is, this is a good place to start and start understanding some of the features that are important to your historic building and its architectural style. And then lastly, I've mentioned and showed some images from different historic paint catalogs. These are on a website called archive.org. There's something that the Association for Preservation Technology has put together called the Building Technology Heritage Library that has thousands of different trade catalogs, not just for paint, but for other historic building materials as well. So, once you start looking through some of these, there are so many other resources that you can go to as well. There are a number of books on historic paint and historic colors based on architectural styles as well. If you have a specific house that you're thinking about repainting or selecting colors for. So that being said, that is sort of my overview of Colorways and painting historic buildings. Feel free to reach out to me with any specific questions. You can find me at Izabella at posthistoricpreservation.com, and I'm happy to, chat with anyone about their historic building. If anybody has any general questions, I think Katie is going to pass those on to me. Is that right, Katie?
Yes, I've got, there's a few.
Okay.
So here, let me pull them up really quick. Okay, so the first one is about kind of how should the paint be applied, whether using a brush or a spray.
Yeah, so I would recommend a brush or a roller. It really depends on the surface that you're painting. One of the challenges with painting historic buildings when you have ornamentation and shingles is, once you build up layers that are too thick, you can sometimes start obscuring those, details, and also kind of it gets sort of like a chunky look to it. So, with more detailed things, I would say using a hand brush or, and then you can usually use a roller for siding, but yeah.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. And the next one is about kind of general maintenance, whether like the horizontal seams on lap siding should be caulked or like filling, basically kind of sealing it up before as a way to prep the siding.
Um, so, one of the things I'll say is you don't want to add non-historic kind of additions or repairs to your building. And you don't necessarily need to caulk between the seams if your boards are moving for some reason, that you might have other kind of sources of moisture that need to be addressed, whether it's, an irrigation system nearby or trees that are dripping on your building. One thing to remember with wood is that wood breathes and it moves all year long. So it does expand and contract throughout the year. So you really don't want to constrict it with any materials like caulking that are harder than the wood, because it can cause the wood to kind of start cracking. So I would say if your building doesn't historically have that, I wouldn't recommend it. That's one of those sort of case by case. I'd have to see exactly what you're looking at to give more guidance if you have some really big areas where moisture is getting in. But generally, you don't want to add non-historic things like that.
Perfect. Great. The next one is if you want to remove paint that from previously painted masonry, what is the best practice, or some guidance on that?
Yeah, so that there are ways to do that. There are products that are manufactured by companies like Proseco that are specifically designed for historic masonry. It requires testing. It requires kind of an understanding of the masonry underneath and the paint coatings that are on top of it, to kind of see the condition of both. So there are products, chemicals that you can be purchased that can be purchased to remove that. If you do want to do that, but you always want to do a lot of research and testing and making sure that you're not using something from Home Depot, but you're using a product that's specifically manufactured for historic masonry, which there are out there if that's something that you need to do.
Perfect. And it looks like Stephanie dropped the website for Proseco in the chat, so everyone can see that. And the next question is, I see too many historic buildings that are incorrectly cleaned or prepared for paint. Could you please talk a little bit about how damaging power washing can be, especially on wood surfaces?
Yeah, so power washers and historic anything are really terrible ideas. It will remove the historic fabric. It essentially is removing parts of the historic building material. Yes, I would echo. I wouldn't take a power washer near anything historic except for maybe concrete in certain cases, but you can really, really cause a lot of damage. Not only with wood can you force water into the material and create all sorts of new moisture issues. You can create a appealing habitat for microorganisms and fungi, but just all sorts of, and mold, all sorts of terrible things. But you can also abrade the surface. Once you start removing historic building material or changing the historic building, you can't get that back. There's only so much patching that you can do to make it look okay. You can't get that back. So anything that you do to historic building, you really don't want to remove any historic fabric, because like I said, you cannot get that back, and then you start a situation where you start having to do selective replacement of things, and then that just kind of has a domino effect. So yes, I would echo, please don't use a power washer on your historic buildings ever.
That's a great advice.
Yeah.
Let's see. There was a couple of other questions in the chat. Chrissy asks, or she says, I have a 1940s American four-square with asbestos shingles on the exterior. Is there anything to know pertaining to that specifically? I guess maybe can those be painted or something like that?
Those should be able to be painted. Yeah, I mean, you know, that's something that I would make sure you have a, you know, paint that is compatible with them, depending on the paint system that you're using. You know, your paint manufacturer should know that, but, you know, not in particular. Just, you know, using a compatible paint, making sure you're cleaning the surface adequately to take paint.
Awesome. And let's see, should we paint the bottom of the bottom rail on windows, screens, and doors? I can kind of, in my opinion, I would say no. Because I think in my experience, potentially they can stick when you're like, if it's for windows, if it's the bottom sash and you're painting the bottom of the bottom rail, if you don't let it dry properly, once it's closed, you could potentially, it could be stuck shut again. Izabella, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I mean, this is a situation where I would say, try to do what was historically done if you know. You know, of course, adding paint, even though it doesn't look like a huge layer to us, is still, you know, a layer of material that you're adding. So you could also sort of affect the how tight all of the seams are, especially with windows and doors. With doors in particular, any coating on the bottom of a door is going to wear off pretty immediately. You know, I mean, one thing that you do have to be aware of is that, you know, wood will, as it moves, the area that's not painted will move at a slightly different rate. But when we're talking about small elements like window elements, I would echo the historic window expert here, Katie, and go with that as well.
I just go with what I've experienced. Yeah, for sure. Let's see. One other question is, have you heard of ceramic paint?
Ceramic paint. I mean, other than paint for ceramics, no.
Okay. I interpreted it as maybe ceramic based paint, but maybe not.
I'm not familiar with that.
I think that came from Loretta. I guess Loretta, if you're still on, if you want to drop, maybe if you want to elaborate in the chat. Oh, she says Rhino Shield.
Not familiar with that.
Okay. Let's see. Another question is, and Loretta, I can certainly look into that and if come up with something. But yeah, I guess it sounds like Izabella isn't familiar with that product. Another question is, do you recommend using linseed oil on old wood after the paint has been removed?
Well, I don't typically recommend removing paint. It kind of depends on the situation. I mean, I know there are some instances, and I've seen with historic windows, so maybe you could chime in here, Katie, when people have used linseed oil in some circumstances to recondition the wood. But generally for an entire like building envelope, I wouldn't. Linseed oil actually can degrade in UV and turn a darker color. So I guess the first part of that is I wouldn't remove the paint, and then that's not generally something I would use.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of individuals using it, like who restore windows professionally. They might put it on the bare wood to help, like Izabella said, as a conditioner. You have to be careful with that because it is combustible. So as it evaporates, like any kind of rags that you use, you need to put them in a fire can, because they can literally like catch fire as the oil evaporates. So just take precaution when using that. And that's really all I know about it personally. I don't really use it in my personal restoration, but that's just me. Let's see. I think there was one more question, and I can help answer this too. They asked if we could talk about San Antonio permit requirements and EPA requirements that a contractor would need to follow. I imagine this is specific to lead-based paint. From what I understand, there's not any kind of local requirement or any regulation, but if somebody is doing this professionally for you, I know that they do have to follow the EPA government, like federal government regulations. And I think that at least one person, like if it's a team of individuals, like they have to be certified for lead-based paint removal, and they have to follow certain precautions as far as like fully suiting up, taping off the area, any kind of removal and remediation needs to be properly done. I don't have the website offhand. There's a couple that, but otherwise I think you can go to like epa.gov for the regulations. So yeah, that's what I know about it. Izabella, do you know really anything about that specifically?
Not specifically, not pertaining to San Antonio, but yeah, I mean, if you're hiring a contractor, they should have, that should be one of the questions that you ask them. They should have a working understanding about that. You certainly don't want to have a contractor who's trying to, skirt around the regulations. One thing with lead paint, as I mentioned, you want to make sure that there's no kind of dust going into the environment or into the ground that can be inhaled or sort of absorbed by the ground. So using, water and collection can help to mitigate that, and certainly personal protection and keeping, children and pets away from the site while you're working on it as well. But yeah, I would start with the EPA website. And it's more, the regulations are more rigorous for commercial contractors than for residential.
For sure. Awesome. I think I covered all of the questions. And I dropped my email address in the chat for everybody. If you have questions pertaining to OHP's role or local permitting, even though we don't deal with the permitting itself, I can answer some questions and direct you to the right people for that. And so if there are no further questions, I want to thank Izabella for presenting to us. This was a great presentation. I learned a lot myself. This was great. And we are, like I said, we did record the presentation, so this will be available on our YouTube channel. And what we'll do is we'll send out a survey. I think Stephanie mentioned this. We'll send a survey with a link to the video and then information about our next Rehabber Club virtual talk happening on May, I believe it's May 20th. Yes, Thursday, May 20th. And we have some folks from Ford, Powell, and Carson who are going to talk about best practices in historic preservation projects and that. So that'll be exciting. So with that said, thank you everybody for joining, and we hope you have a great night. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.